My name is Jason, and this new year I decided to spend it alone. After a tough year filled with a series of unfortunate events, especially after breaking up with my girlfriend, I decided that a bit of quiet and solitude was exactly what I needed. My goal was simple: to rent a cabin, immerse myself in the winter atmosphere, and maybe start writing the book I had long planned. The cabin I chose was located in the woods of Maine. It was an old structure, built back in the 1930s, with a massive fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and an incredibly cozy appearance that perfectly matched my vision of an ideal retreat. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the neighbors were so far that even the smoke from their chimneys was barely visible. Silence, peace, and a true winter wonderland, that's what I expected. I arrived at the cabin on the evening of December 30th. The cold winter air stung my face, and around me was a perfect winter silence, interrupted only occasionally by the sound of my footsteps crunching in the snow. The owner had left me the key in a small metal box next to the door. Inside, it looked just as I had seen in the photos: wooden walls, a large fireplace, minimalist furniture, but everything felt perfect. As I unpacked and decided to turn on the heating, something caught my attention. An old radio sat on the kitchen table. It looked archaic, with a round dial and a few buttons. It seemed like it had been left there by accident. I found it amusing and decided not to touch it, but it immediately gave me a strange feeling. The first evening passed peacefully. I lit the fireplace, made myself hot chocolate, and picked up a book I had been putting off for a while. But closer to nightfall, the first oddities began to happen. Sitting by the fireplace, I suddenly heard a sound, faint, like a whisper. It was so unclear at first that I attributed it to the wind blowing around the cabin. But the sound repeated. I got up, went to the window, and peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. It was quiet outside the door as well. Probably just fatigue, I thought, and decided to go to bed. However, during the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a song. It sounded like an old melody being played on the radio, but the sound was coming from the kitchen. My heart began to race. I remembered the radio, but I hadn't even turned it on. I cautiously walked to the kitchen, trying to be as quiet as possible. Sure enough, the radio had turned on. It was playing some very old song, something about New Year, but the words sounded as though someone was whispering them instead of singing. I turned it off, unplugged it from the outlet, and went back to bed. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I had planned. My sleep had been restless, and the strange melody from the radio still echoed in my mind. I brushed it off as my imagination. Deep down, I probably knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it. Outside, it was a perfect winter morning, snow-covered forests, blue skies, and complete silence. I decided not to let minor oddities ruin my retreat, so I bundled up and went for a walk. The snow crunched under my feet, and the farther I walked, the more I felt as though I wasn't alone. At one point, I noticed strange tracks in the snow. They were fresh, much larger than human footprints, with long fingers or claws leaving distinct impressions. The tracks started near the cabin and led deep into the woods. I stopped, studying them. Maybe they're from some animal? I thought. But there was something wrong about these tracks. They were too large, and the spacing between them was unnervingly even. Despite my growing unease, I decided to follow them. The tracks led me farther and farther from the cabin. The forest grew denser, and the snow on the tree branches hung heavier. After a few minutes, I noticed that the tracks abruptly ended, as though whatever had made them had simply vanished. I looked around but saw nothing but trees and snow. Suddenly, I heard a sound, like a branch snapping. My chest tightened with fear. Turning around, I saw nothing but empty space. It's probably just a deer or some bird, I whispered to myself, trying to calm down. Back at the cabin, I decided to write everything down in the journal I always carried with me. I described the tracks, the sound in the woods, and the strange feeling of being watched. The day passed peacefully. I cooked dinner, read a book, and tried not to think about what I had seen. But as the sun set, the unease began to creep back. The fireplace crackled, filling the cabin with warmth, but the sense of cold wouldn't leave me. Later that evening, I heard the sound again. It was the same whisper. It came from the window near the kitchen. My heart froze. It was so clear that I could no longer blame it on the wind. I approached the window and peered outside. Darkness. Just dark trees and the glint of snowflakes under the moonlight. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, deeper, and I began to make out distinct words. Jason! Jason! I recoiled from the window. Someone knew my name. I grabbed a flashlight and dashed outside. But there was nothing. No tracks, no sounds. When I returned, I saw that the radio had turned on again. At that exact moment, it suddenly went silent, and the cabin fell into an eerie quiet. I turned off all the lights and locked myself in the bedroom. But even behind the closed door, I could hear something in the living room whispering my name. I woke up with the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching me all night. My sleep had been fragmented and uneasy. Fragments of strange sounds and that whisper from the previous evening swirled in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but something in me refused to believe it. The morning was gloomy. The gray sky felt heavy, and although the snow had stopped, the cold seeped deep into my bones. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and check the area around the cabin. My eyes immediately fell on the snow in front of the door. There were footprints, but not the ones I had seen in the forest yesterday. These were human. They led directly to the cabin but stopped at the door. There were no tracks leading back. My heart began to race. Who could it have been? And more importantly, how did they disappear? I looked around, searching for any signs of another person, but there was nothing. The forest was silent, eerily so. I decided to check the other sides of the cabin for more clues. Walking around the building, I didn't find any additional tracks, but I noticed something else. On the glass of one of the windows, there was a symbol or a letter drawn with a finger on the condensation. I was certain it hadn't been there before. The mark resembled an uneven X with extra lines. I took a picture of it with my phone, but a few seconds later, as if on command, the mark vanished. When I checked my phone, the photo was blurry, as if the camera had refused to focus. Back inside, I made myself some coffee and tried to distract myself, but the thoughts of the footprints and the symbol wouldn't leave my mind. Something wasn't right. I decided to document everything in my journal to record the events, even if they turned out to be nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. By midday, I decided to go for another walk. However, as soon as I stepped outside, I noticed that the footprints in front of the cabin had disappeared. In their place was a perfectly smooth layer of snow, as if they had never existed. Maybe it was the wind overnight, I began to think, but the explanation seemed too implausible. I decided to follow the same path I had taken the day before. I returned to the spot where I had seen the large tracks. They were still there, but now there were more of them. The tracks moved in a chaotic pattern, forming circles. At one point, I stopped and noticed something else. They seemed to be moving closer to where I was standing, as if something was approaching me. I quickened my pace, eager to return to the cabin. But before I could, I heard it again, the snapping of a branch. It came from somewhere very close. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound confident, though my voice trembled slightly. There was no reply. I turned, scanning the trees around me, but all I saw were gray trunks and white snow. And then I saw it. A figure. Dark and still, standing several dozen meters away. It blended almost seamlessly with the shadows of the trees. My flashlight illuminated its outline, but I couldn't make out its face or clothing. I began backing away. The figure remained motionless, but as soon as I took another step in the snow, it suddenly disappeared. As if it had never been there. Back at the cabin, I locked all the doors and windows. There was something in that forest, and it definitely knew I was here. Evening came faster than I expected. The cabin was quiet, but the silence felt unnatural. No sounds from outside, not even the wind. I sat by the fireplace, trying to focus on my book, but my thoughts kept returning to the figure I had seen in the forest. What was it? A person? An animal? Or something else entirely? Suddenly, the radio came to life again. This time, I felt real fear. It had been unplugged. The cord lay separately, and I knew I hadn't touched it. The radio hissed, as though trying to tune into a frequency, and then I heard a voice. "Jason," it said softly, slowly, almost tenderly. My heart jumped. It was the voice of my old friend, Alex. But that was impossible. Alex had died in a car accident 2 years ago. "Jason, help me!" I leapt to my feet and yanked the cord out of the radio, even though it wasn't connected. The sound vanished, but its echo lingered in my mind. With trembling hands, I opened a cupboard, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and poured myself a hefty glass. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of hallucination, or maybe a hidden speaker left behind as a prank. But I knew that wasn't true. The hours crawled by slowly, but nothing else happened. However, as the clock's hand neared midnight, I heard it again. A knock at the door. 3 clear, deliberate knocks. I froze. Who could be out here, at a remote cabin, in the middle of the night? At first, I decided to ignore it. Maybe it was the wind or some random animal. But the knocking repeated. This time it was louder, almost demanding. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to mask my fear. There was no reply. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly approached the door. The knocking had stopped, but I could hear a faint noise. It sounded like someone whispering on the other side of the door. "Jason, it's me. Alex. Open the door." It was his voice. But I couldn't believe my ears. "You're not Alex," I said, trying to sound firm. "Alex is dead. Please, Jason. I'm cold." The whisper grew more insistent, but I didn't open the door. Something deep inside told me I mustn't. Then everything went quiet. But seconds later, I heard another sound. Footsteps. They started at the door and moved around the cabin. Then something began scratching at the window. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay as far from the window as possible, but the sound followed me. It was as if it knew exactly where I was. Then I heard the voice again. This time it came from the other side of the cabin. "Jason, open up. I know you're in there." I tried to ignore it, covering my ears with my hands. But the voice kept calling my name, and the scratching wouldn't stop. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police, but the connection dropped as soon as I dialed. The screen lit up with a red message. "Take us home." That was only the beginning. I sat on the floor clutching my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The message on the screen still glowed. "Take us home." Suddenly, everything went silent. The scratching at the windows, the whispers at the door, all of it vanished, as if it had never been there. Only the heavy silence remained with me. Forcing myself to stand, though my legs trembled, all I wanted at that moment was to run. But how? Out here, at night in this forest, I didn't dare. I decided to try to understand what was happening. 2 thoughts swirled in my head: either I was losing my mind, or there was something in this cabin that I couldn't comprehend. Remembering the strange radio, I began searching the house for any clues. In the attic, inside an old suitcase, I found something unusual: a journal. Its cover was worn, leather-bound, and the pages were yellowed. It clearly belonged to someone who had lived here many years ago. I opened it. The handwriting was small and uneven, as if the writer had been in a hurry. December 27th. I feel something changing. At first, it was just sounds. Whispers. Laughter. I thought it was the wind. But now I see them. They stand in the forest, watching. They are waiting. My heart tightened. I flipped through a few more pages. December 30th. They are trying to get in. Knocking on the doors. Voices. I know it's not my friends. They take the form of those I loved, but it's a lie. They want me to open the door. A heavy weight settled in my stomach. This sounded eerily familiar, as if this unknown writer had gone through exactly what I was experiencing. On one of the last pages, I found an entry that sent a chill through me. January 1st. They don't leave. I can't escape this place. I need to find the well. It's the only answer. If you're reading this, don't open the door. Don't listen to them. Go to the well. The well? I remembered seeing something similar during one of my walks near the forest. But now, I wasn't sure I wanted to go there. Suddenly, I heard quiet laughter. It was coming from somewhere in the house, muffled but unmistakably real. I quickly ran to the fireplace, grabbed the first piece of wood I could find, holding it like a weapon. "Who's there?" I shouted. There was no reply. But the laughter continued. I searched the rooms, but I found no one. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started. But now, I felt something else, a cold breath on the back of my neck. Turning around, I saw a shadow in the corner of the room. It was tall, motionless, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. I stepped back, trying not to lose sight of it, but it dissolved into nothing, like smoke. Returning to the living room, I noticed that the journal was now open to a different page. I was certain I hadn't left it that way. On the new page, there was only one sentence. "They will come for you at midnight." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The clock showed 11:45 p.m. Time moved too quickly. The clock on the wall kept ticking, its hands inching closer to midnight. I sat in the living room, clutching the wooden log from the fireplace, knowing full well it wouldn't offer much protection. Cold sweat ran down my back. 11:50 p.m. The whispers returned. At first faint, barely audible, but they quickly grew louder, as if the voices were drawing nearer with every passing second. "Jason, open the door!" I stood, breathing heavily. My entire body was tense. The voices were varied, male, female, even children's. It sounded as though dozens of people were gathered just beyond the door. "It's just your imagination," I whispered to myself, but I didn't believe my own words. 11:55 p.m. A knock at the door made me jump. It was soft but insistent. 3 knocks. Then a pause. 3 more. "Jason. It's me, Mom. Please open the door." My heart stopped. That voice, it was my mother's. She had died 5 years ago. "No!" I shouted, backing away. "You're not my mom!" The voice changed. Now it was Alice, my ex-girlfriend. "Jason, please, I know you're in there. You love me, don't you?" I pressed my hands over my ears, trying not to listen. The voices grew louder, the whispers morphing into screams. The knocking on the door became so forceful that it shook on its hinges. 11:58 p.m. Suddenly, everything went silent. An oppressive stillness filled the cabin. I slowly lifted my head, sensing it was only the calm before the storm. And then I heard them. Footsteps. They were no longer at the door. They were inside. My heart stopped. How? Every door was locked. I looked around but saw nothing. The footsteps grew closer. They were uneven, creaking heavily on the wooden floor as if someone with a limp was moving toward me. "Show yourself!" I shouted, spinning around. 11:59 p.m. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes. They were pitch black, devoid of any light or reflection. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping. The figure didn't move, it just stared at me. "What do you want?" I croaked. It didn't answer. But I heard a voice in my head. "You will open the door, or we will make you." Before I could respond, every window in the cabin shattered at once. A freezing wind roared inside, extinguishing the fire in the hearth. Darkness consumed the room. Midnight. I heard the front door slowly creak open. When the door opened, every instinct in me screamed, "Don't look!" But I couldn't resist. Slowly, I turned and saw them. Silhouettes. Shadows. They weren't human, though they tried to appear so. Some were impossibly tall, others grotesquely hunched. Their forms shifted constantly, like distorted reflections on rippling water. Their eyes glowed with a faint white light. The shadows began moving toward me, completely silent except for their whispering voices. "Jason, you belong to us." I stepped back, my legs trembling beneath me. "Get out!" I screamed, though I knew my words would have no effect. One of the figures stopped right in front of me. Its face was blurry, as if it couldn't decide what form to take. For a fleeting moment, I recognized familiar features: my mother's eyes, Alice's smile, barely visible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have stayed here," it said, its voice muffled as though coming from underwater. "We've been waiting for you." "What do you want from me?" I croaked. "The well," it replied. Its eyes glowed brighter. "Take us home." My body froze. The well. The one mentioned in the journal. They wanted me to go there. "No! I'm not going anywhere!" I shouted, bolting toward the kitchen where I'd left a knife. But they were faster. The shadows closed in around me, and a suffocating cold enveloped my body. It was like plunging into icy water. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then that voice spoke again, deep and otherworldly. "If you won't, we'll make you." Darkness swallowed everything. I woke up in the snow. The cabin was far behind me. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, but my legs seemed to move on their own. In front of me stood the well I'd seen before. It was surrounded by strange symbols etched into the stone. A frayed, old rope hung above it, its ends disappearing into the blackness of the well's opening. The shadows were here. They stood around me, forming a tight circle. "Look into the well, Jason," a voice said from behind me. I didn't turn around. Every fiber of my being screamed not to obey. But my legs began moving on their own, carrying me closer. "Do you want to go back? Do you want freedom? Look." I approached the edge and peered inside. What I saw was worse than any nightmare. In the darkness, I could make out faces. Hundreds of faces. Twisted, distorted, but their eyes were alive. They stared at me, their mouths moving as they whispered a single word. "Release." I recoiled, but the shadows pushed me closer. "You must finish it. Take us home." Then I understood. They wanted me to go into the well. To become one of them. Summoning every ounce of willpower I had left, I screamed. "No!" I broke free from their grasp and ran. The snow clung to my legs, the wind sliced at my face, but I didn't look back. Their voices trailed behind me, whispering and shouting at the same time, but I just kept running. I don't remember how I made it to the road. Morning had broken, gray and grim, and the first car I saw stopped to pick me up. The driver, an elderly man, looked at me with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" I couldn't find the words. All I could manage was a whisper. "I'm never going back there." The elderly man drove me to the nearest town. I remained silent the entire way, my thoughts a chaotic storm. Images of the shadows, the whispers, the well, they felt both real and unreal at the same time. I tried to rationalize everything, but each attempt ended in the same, bone-deep fear. The driver, whose name was Richard, insisted I go into the local cafe for something warm to drink. I didn't argue. Inside, the place was crowded, but the warmth and coziness were a stark contrast to the events I had just endured. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Richard said, sitting across from me at the table. I tried to smile but failed. "I was at that cabin," I said quietly, staring into my half-empty coffee cup. Richard paused mid-sip and gave me a puzzled look. "Which cabin?" he asked. "That old one in the woods. I rented it online. It looked run down but normal." Richard's face darkened immediately. "The cabin on the old Maxwell property?" I nodded, though I didn't know its name. "Buddy, you have no idea what you walked into," he said, leaning closer and lowering his voice. "People around here say it's haunted. Something happened to the folks who lived there years ago." "What kind of something?" I asked, my heartbeat quickening. "Different stories," he replied. But the one people tell most is about the well. Folks say it's not just a well, it's something much older. Something that's been there long before people. Several families vanished, and all the signs led back to that property. I swallowed hard. His words aligned with everything I had experienced. Why me? Why did this happen to me? I asked. Richard shook his head. I don't know. But you survived. That's more than most can say. I was about to respond when I noticed something in the cafe window. Shadows. They stood outside the glass, motionless, just staring at me. No. They're here, I whispered. What? Who's here? Richard asked, looking around. The shadows. They found me. He didn't see them, but to me, they were absolutely real. Even when I shut my eyes, they remained. I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the table. I need to leave, I said, feeling the cold grip of fear wrap around me again. Richard tried to stop me, but I ran outside. People turned to look as I passed, but I didn't care. The shadows were everywhere, by the cars, near the trees, even in the doorways of shops. Leave me alone! I shouted, but they only kept drawing closer. Then I heard the whisper again. The well. You didn't finish. I realized they wouldn't let me go. Despair gripped me, but a strange thought surfaced. If this place was their connection to our world, maybe I could sever it. I turned back to Richard. Can you take me back? To the cabin? He stared at me as though I'd lost my mind. You're serious? Yes. It's the only way. Please, I have to go back. After a long hesitation, he nodded. The drive back was silent. The shadows never stopped following us, appearing in the distance along the roadside. When we arrived at the cabin, every muscle in my body tensed. Are you sure about this? Richard asked as I prepared to go inside. I don't have a choice. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I stepped into the cabin. Nothing had changed, but the whispers were louder than ever. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the well. The shadows were already there, waiting. Now you're ours, Jason. I looked at the rope hanging above the dark opening of the well and took a deep breath. No, I whispered. You belong to me. From my pocket, I pulled out a box of matches I had taken from the cabin. I struck one and lit the rope. Flames quickly engulfed it, spreading to the edges of the well. The shadows screamed as the fire consumed the rope and licked at the well's stone. I felt something powerful trying to hold me back, but I stepped away, watching the flames grow. It ends here, I shouted. The shadows writhed and dissolved into the darkness, their screams fading into silence as the fire burned brighter. The oppressive cold lifted, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. When the flames finally died down, the well was silent, its edges charred and broken. The connection was severed. They were gone. I turned to see Richard standing at a distance, his face pale but relieved. Let's get out of here, he said. I nodded, knowing I would never return to this place. The flames roared, licking the edges of the well, consuming the rope and the symbols carved into the stone. The air reeked of burning mixed with something rotten and otherworldly. The whispers of the shadows turned into deafening roars, so loud it made my ears ring. They screamed. Their shapes began to blur, as though the fire wasn't just destroying the rope but erasing their existence. I watched as they writhed, trying to hold on, their twisted hands reaching for me but unable to come closer. You will pay, Jason, came one last sinister whisper before their forms dissolved into nothingness. The well cracked with a thunderous noise. The edges caved inward, releasing clouds of smoke and ash that swirled into the air. The darkness that had radiated from it vanished. All that remained was a hole, an emptiness that no longer held power over this place. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The cold ground beneath my hands was a stark reminder that I was still alive. It's over, I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure if it was true. I made my way back to the cabin to grab my things and leave this place for good. Richard was still waiting by the car, and I felt a wave of relief seeing him. Everything okay? He asked as I approached. I think so, I replied, sliding into the passenger seat. We drove in silence. Though my body was utterly exhausted, I felt a strange calmness. It seemed as though the shadows were gone, and this place no longer held any power over the world. But everything changed when we reached the town. At the cafe where I had been earlier, I caught something in the reflection of the window. A shadow. Just one. It stood far away, at the end of the street, motionless, but it was there. I turned away, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. Something wrong? Richard asked, noticing my reaction. No, nothing, I said, though the gnawing feeling of unease crept back in. A month has passed, yet I still can't fully forget that night. The shadows no longer appear so blatantly, but I can feel them. In the dark corners of rooms, in the reflections of glass, in the whisper of the wind. I've tried to return to normal life, but there's always a sense that something remains unfinished. Did I truly sever their connection to our world? Or did I awaken something far more terrifying? Sometimes at night, when I lie down to sleep, I hear their voices. They whisper my name, but now they don't ask me to open the door. They're waiting for me to take the first step. I can't look into mirrors anymore.